Hello everyone, this is Louise, and in this coffee break session I want to explain the new user licensing for Windows to you. This session was recorded in early November 2014 and it gives you an overview of the new licensing options that will be available from Microsoft from the 1st of December 2014. So let's take a look at the options that customers will have for licensing Windows per user. And the first one we're going to look at is the add-on USL. Now, if you're familiar with add-on USLs, you'll know that they need to be added on to something. And this add-on user subscription license is used to add on to the traditional Windows licenses that we're used to today. Let's take a look. So here I've got a machine that's got an underlying qualifying operating system, Windows 7 Pro or Windows 8 Pro, and I can purchase for that device a Windows 8.1 Enterprise Upgrade license with software assurance. And what I can do is assign to that device a primary user. And if you're familiar with our slides, you'll know that this primary user in particular has a name. It's Mrs. Lime, and we're going to see what rights she has to use Windows in different ways under that SA license that's attached to the device. So let's take a look. First of all, I want to consider this to be a corporate owned PC, and I want to look at the different options that the IT department would have for delivering Windows to that device. And we're going to first of all look if this device was used in the corporate premises. What choices would you have for deploying Windows under that license? Well, here are the choices. You could choose to deploy it locally, install it actually on the device, or you could run virtual desktops from a server through a virtual desktop infrastructure, a VDI desktop, or in fact, you could decide to deploy corporate images on USB sticks and use Windows to go. And in that case, Mrs. Lime would sit at the device, insert the USB stick, and her corporate desktop would be available to her. All of those things are options under that SA license when it's a corporate-owned device used in the corporate premises. But let's say Mrs. Lime takes that device home. What rights has she got to use Windows there? Well, it's not really a surprise here that she gets exactly the same rights. It's a device-based license, so we would expect the rights to be consistent wherever she wanted to use that device. But what changes is when we consider a third-party owned PC or tablet device, and this could be perhaps one of Mrs. Lime's own devices, or it could be a device that she's using in an internet cafe or a hotel kiosk, for example. Let's take an example of her own devices, and let's say that she brings those devices into the corporate premises. What rights does she have under the SA license attached to that device at the top left there for these devices that she's brought in? Well, you'll see she doesn't get any rights at all. So if she brings her own iPad in or she brings her own laptop in, then she can't use Windows in any of the ways that we've discussed. But things change if she uses her own device at home outside of the corporate premises. And you can see here that the rights she'd get, she'd be allowed to access a VDI desktop or she'd be allowed to use a Windows to Go desktop. And if you're familiar with the rights that software assurance gives, you'll know that it's roaming use rights that allow her to use the two desktops at the bottom of the screen there because she's the primary user of the licensed device. So what we have is the situation today before the user licensing for Windows is available. But now let's have a look at what the add-on is going to give. So the add-on, as I said, adds on to a license, and it's the license you see here that it needs to be added on to. The USL, the user subscription license, is of course assigned to a user, and it has to be assigned to the person that we've already made the primary user of the device that's licensed with the underlying license. So here, what I do is I buy for Mrs. Lime a Windows SA per user add-on USL, and it absolutely, as I say, needs to be added on to that device license at the left there. But what rights does this give her? Well, let's first of all look at some PCs with qualifying operating systems, so Windows 7 or 8 Pro, or Windows tablets with less than 10.1 inch screens, and these devices don't have to have a qualifying operating system. How can we deploy Windows to those sorts of devices under this new USL? Well, Mrs. Lime, if she's got one of these devices, and we'll talk about ownership in a second, but if she's got one of these devices, then she can bring it into the office and she can use Windows in all of those ways. Probably not simultaneously, but she's got access to all of those if she needs them. If she uses a device at home, the rights are exactly the same. What about though if we've got a device that doesn't have a qualifying operating system on it? Perhaps it's an older device. Well, I've classed these as any other x86 devices, and you'll see here all that changes is the local installation rights. So again, Mrs. Lime can bring devices into the office, she can use them at home, the rights are the same, and she can get at her VDI or her Windows to Go desktop as she needs to. And what about all of the devices that I'm going to call other devices here? So it could be an iPad or a non-Windows tablet, or it could be a Windows phone. What rights would she have for those devices? Well, again, they're exactly the same wherever she chooses to use those devices, and she can access her VDI desktop from any of those devices. And you'll note probably that those devices aren't going to be able to install Windows locally or run Windows to Go. So it is a licensing limitation, but obviously also a technical one. Now, the last thing I said I wanted to cover here is the ownership. And in fact, those devices I've put, they can be owned by anyone. So this could be a personally owned device by Mrs. Lime. It could be a device that her business owns, or it could be, as we said, those hotel kiosk devices. It doesn't matter. All that matters is that when Windows is deployed to the device, that it's for Mrs. Lime's use only. So with local installation rights, could Mrs. Lime go to her friend's house and install Windows locally on a qualifying device? Yes, she could, but it would only be for her use. So perhaps not the best use of the usage rights for her in that instance. So that's the Windows SA per user add-on USL, and a new word I'll introduce you to here is userifying, and you can see that this add-on USL usifies Windows so that the license is not attached to a device, it's attached to a user, and here allows Mrs. Lime to use any device she wants to in various ways to get Windows delivered to that device. But that's not the only license that will be available. That's the add-on USL. You may well be wondering if there will be a full USL which doesn't need the underlying license, and indeed there will be. I've just changed two things on this slide. I've changed the title. It now says Windows SA per user full USL. And if you look at the USL assigned to Mrs. Lime, that's not the add-on anymore, that's the full USL. Otherwise, the slide is the same, but of course, because this is a full USL, we don't need the underlying license. So in fact, I can grey that side of the screen out, and you can see the usage rights are exactly the same for the full USL. But there is one other condition to be aware of, and the condition is that to buy the license for Mrs. Lime, to buy this Windows SA per user full USL, she has to have assigned to her a primary work device, and that device has to be licensed with Windows 7 or 8 Pro. So it has to have the qualifying underlying operating system attached to that device. Once that condition's in place, then Mrs. Lime is allowed to use any device and to have Windows delivered to her in the ways that you see marked on the screen there. So the Windows SA per user full USL gives all the rights that you see, as long as it's assigned to a user who has a work device that they're using for most of the time at work that has the qualifying Windows 7 or Windows 8 Pro assigned to it. Well, that brings me to the end of this session on the Windows user licensing. If you'd like to keep up to date with all things licensing, then our blog is a very good way of doing that. It's at blog.licensingschool.co.uk, and you'll get regular updates on everything that's happening in the world of licensing. I hope you've enjoyed this session, and I look forward to delivering other sessions to you in the future. Bye-bye.